Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Sunday afternoon at the Pig family house, and everyone was taking their usual nap. Peppa woke up first. But the house was strangely quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a lazy Sunday, but an empty, hollow silence that made her ears ring. She went to check on George in his room, but his bed was perfectly made as if no one had ever slept in it. His toys were arranged in neat rows, all facing the door, as if they had been watching and waiting for someone to enter. The dinosaur toy that George loved so much was sitting on the pillow, but its plastic eyes seemed to follow Peppa as she moved around the room. Mummy and Daddy Pig's bedroom was the same. The bed was made. Their clothes were folded perfectly, and everything was in its exact place, but there were no signs that anyone had been there recently. No wrinkled sheets, no books left open, no glasses on the nightstand. It was as if they had simply vanished. Peppa called out for her family, but her voice echoed strangely in the house. Instead of the normal echo that bounced off walls, her voice seemed to stretch and distort, coming back to her as whispers from different rooms. The whispers sounded like her family's voices, but they were saying things she had never heard them say before. She went downstairs to the kitchen and found that dinner was already prepared on the table, for plates with steaming food, as if someone had just finished cooking. But the food was wrong. It looked like their usual meals, but the colors were too bright, the shapes too perfect, like plastic food from a toy kitchen set. The living room felt enormous. The purple sofa seemed miles away from the television, and the ceiling stretched up higher than it should have. Peppa's footsteps echoed loudly on the floor, but when she looked down, she couldn't see her feet. The green carpet seemed to ripple and move like water beneath her. The photographs on the walls had changed. They still showed the Pig family, but in each picture, one family member was missing. In some photos, George wasn't there. In others, Daddy Pig had vanished. And in a few, Peppa herself was absent from family moments she remembered being part of. As evening approached, the house began to fill with sounds. Footsteps in the hallway, but no one was there. Voices having conversations in empty rooms. The sound of George playing with his toys upstairs. But when Peppa went to check, the room was still empty and silent. The telephone started ringing, but every time Peppa answered it, the line was dead. The television turned on by itself, showing programs she had never seen before. They looked like episodes of her own life, but with small differences. In these episodes, she was an only child, or her parents looked slightly different, or the house had extra rooms she had never seen. By nighttime, Peppa realized she might be completely alone in the house, but the house itself seemed to be trying to convince her that her family was still there. Plates appeared and disappeared from the kitchen table. Beds became unmade and then made themselves again. Lights turned on and off in patterns that seemed almost like a code. The episode ended with Peppa sitting in her bedroom, listening to the sounds of a family that might not exist anymore, while the house around her continued its elaborate performance of normal life, trying to keep her from realizing that she might be the only real thing left in a world that was slowly becoming as artificial as a dollhouse. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her toy train set in the living room. The train, usually so cheerful, began to make strange, clanking noises, and its lights flickered erratically. She tried to stop it, but it sped up, circling the room faster and faster, leaving a trail of dark, oily smoke. The smoke filled the room, making it hard to see, and the clanking grew louder, more menacing. The train cars transformed, their windows becoming empty, staring eyes, and their wheels grinding like teeth. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa stumbled back, her heart pounding. The train was no longer a toy, but a monstrous entity, chasing her around the room. She could hear faint whispers coming from the train, calling her name, inviting her to join its endless journey. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted train seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the train was gone, but the tracks were etched into the floor, glowing with an eerie green light. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the glowing green tracks, leading into an abyss. And then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim.
Peppa Pig, The Cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet, scraping. A knock, slow. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George," she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word, "Open." Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall, not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's," Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, no cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. "You probably had a bad dream," said Mummy Pig gently. "Let's try to forget about it." But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then a voice, a whisper. "I'm almost out. Don't turn around." This is the story of what happened when Peppa Pig's family went to the beach for what they thought would be a normal day. But sometimes, the most dangerous predators wear the most innocent disguises. It was a sunny day when the pig family arrived at the beach. Peppa was building sandcastles when she noticed strange footprints in the sand. Clear impressions of sneakers leading directly from the ocean onto the beach. "Daddy, look at these footprints," Peppa called out. Daddy Pig chuckled. Someone probably just walked into the water wearing their shoes. But Peppa followed the sneaker prints towards some large rocks. As she got closer, she heard soft, melodic humming. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. Peppa crept around the rocks and gasped. Sitting on the sand was an enormous shark wearing bright blue Nike sneakers, singing happily to itself. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark sang, noticing Peppa. It grinned with rows of sharp teeth. Hello there! Want to play? Despite her fear, Peppa found herself playing beach ball with the creature, watching as it skillfully kicked the ball with its sneaker-clad fins. You're really good at this, Peppa laughed. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la! I love to play, the shark sang back. That evening, a loud knock echoed through their house. When Daddy Pig opened the door, there stood the shark, still wearing its blue sneakers. Hello, I've come to visit. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark announced, pushing inside and making itself at home. The shark squeezed through the doorway and began devouring everything at the dinner table. Plates, food, even the tablecloth. What on earth is happening? Mummy Pig exclaimed. I was hungry. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. It sang with its mouth full. From that day forward, everything changed. The shark decided to stay and established new rules. Everyone had to wear sneakers and sing tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la throughout the day. The shark took over Peppa's bedroom, forcing her to sleep on a mat. One night, Peppa and George tried to sneak out, but the shark was waiting at the door. Where do you think you're going? Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, nobody leaves my family. It sang menacingly, dragging them back inside. The house transformed quickly. Windows were sealed with thick glass, water filled the lower floors, and a sign appeared reading, Danger, aggressive shark inside. Neighbors would walk by and hear singing from inside. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. We're all one family now. Through the round window, you could see them. Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, all wearing blue sneakers, all singing the shark's song. Behind them, the massive silhouette swam in circles, its toothy grin never fading. And so the shark had found its perfect family. The beach was quiet again, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. And if you do, you'd better run, because the shark is always looking for new family members to join its endless song.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa had lived in her house her entire life, but she had never noticed the small door under the stairs until today. It was painted the same yellow as the walls, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The door was barely tall enough for her to crawl through, and it had no handle, just a small keyhole. When she asked Mummy Pig about it, her mother's face went pale and she quickly changed the subject. Daddy Pig pretended he couldn't see the door at all, walking right past it as if it didn't exist. That night, Peppa heard scratching sounds coming from behind the door, like tiny claws against wood. She crept downstairs and pressed her ear against the door, hearing what sounded like children playing. But their laughter was wrong, too high, too sharp, lasting too long. The next morning, she found a small brass key on her pillow, old and tarnished, that fit perfectly into the door's keyhole. Against her better judgment, Peppa turned the key and heard the lock click open. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever into darkness. Cool air flowed out, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something sweet and rotten. As she peered into the tunnel, she heard her own voice calling from deep within the darkness. But the voice was singing a song she didn't remember learning. The voice grew closer, and Peppa realized with terror that something wearing her voice was crawling up through the tunnel toward her. She slammed the door shut and turned the key, but she could still hear her own voice on the other side, now pleading to be let out.
Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty. And on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft, and familiar. But now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George. And in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall. The day was damp and overcast. Rain had fallen since morning, and only by evening did it subside, leaving the yard filled with shining puddles and wet grass. Peppa and George ran outside, jumping in the puddles, laughing, building a little tower of stones. Everything seemed ordinary. Inside the house smelled of dinner, and from the kitchen came Mummy Pig's voice. But when the sun finally disappeared, a strange sound drifted from the forest. It wasn't barking, nor the creak of wind. Heavy, dragging breaths, as if something enormous was slowly moving between the trees. Peppa stopped and peered into the thicket. There, in the shadows, stood a tall figure. At first she thought it was a deer, but its steps were too slow, too heavy. Each hoofbeat sent a shudder through the ground. And then Peppa saw the eyes, red, burning like embers in the dark. Massive antlers tangled with branches, as if the forest itself had grown through the creature. "Peppa!" George whispered, clutching her hand. The figure took a step forward. The ground trembled. The children screamed and rushed to the house. Daddy Pig flung open the door and pulled them inside, quickly locking the bolts. In the same moment, the silhouette loomed over the windows and the antlers scraped across the roof, leaving long scars. The house grew cold, the air thickened, the lamps flickered. In the glass appeared not their familiar reflections, but shadows with crimson eyes. Mummy Pig clutched George, and Peppa felt the walls were breathing, letting in strange sounds, the whisper of branches, the crack of bark. The monster did not leave. It slowly circled the house. Each step left deep hoof prints, and those prints seemed to echo inside as well. The floor shuddered, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The house responded to every movement. Daddy Pig tried to draw the curtains, but the fabric clung to the glass. Beyond the window, there was no yard, only thicket, dense and endless. The moon broke through the branches, and between them, the red eyes flared again. The creature came closer. Its antlers struck the wall, and cracks spread through the wood. Shadows stretched out, forming shapes like hands. Peppa and George pressed themselves against their mother. "He won't leave," Peppa whispered. The monster loomed on every side. Its breath was heard everywhere, from beneath the floor, from the corridors, from the very roof. The air turned icy, and each breath came heavy, as if the house itself lived and breathed with it. In the living room, the light went out. In the darkness, only the eyes remained. They were outside and inside, seen in the windows, in the mirror, even in the black corners of the room. Daddy Pig grabbed the children's hands, but a step backward changed nothing. Behind them, the walls were no longer walls. Instead of wallpaper rose damp tree trunks, and roots pushed up through the floor. The house was turning into forest. Mummy Pig held George tight. Peppa clung to Daddy's hand. All four huddled in one corner, but corners no longer existed. The house dissolved, and the forest took its place. The whisper filled everything. It almost sounded like words, but none could be understood. Only one feeling remained. There was nowhere to go. The last thing the family saw was the creature's antlers breaking through the ceiling, and its red eyes reflecting in every window at once. Since then, no one has seen the pig family. Their house still stands in the same place, but on rainy evenings it seems to merge with the forest. Inside it smells of resin and damp bark. Stains darken the walls, and pine cones lie in the corners. They say sometimes through the glass you can glimpse reflections, not just empty rooms, but red eyes, unblinking and cold. And in the thicket near the house, children's voices are heard, calling for help. The deer monster no longer returns to the forest. Now he is here, and he waits.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Peppa discovered that her house had grown new rooms overnight. She first noticed it when she went to brush her teeth before bed. The bathroom door, which had always been at the end of the hallway, was now in the middle, and there were two more doors beyond it that she had never seen before. The first new door led to a room that looked exactly like her bedroom, but everything was backwards. The bed was on the opposite wall. The window showed a different view, and all her toys were arranged in mirror image. When she looked in the mirror in this backwards room, her reflection waved with the wrong hand. The second new door opened to a kitchen that was identical to theirs. But the family sitting at the table wasn't quite right. There was another Mummy Pig, but her orange dress was purple, another Daddy Pig, but his glasses were square instead of round, and another George, but he was holding a teddy bear instead of his dinosaur. Peppa tried to go back to her real bedroom, but now there were even more doors in the hallway. Each one led to another version of their house, with small differences that made her feel dizzy. In one house, the stairs went down instead of up. In another, the living room had a fireplace that didn't exist in her real home. The strangest part was that in each house, there was another version of her family. They all looked almost right, but something was always wrong. One daddy pig had no mustache. One mummy pig had short hair. One George was taller than he should be. And in every house, there was another Peppa. But she was always doing something different. As the night went on, Peppa found herself lost in the maze of identical but wrong houses. She would think she had found her way back to her real room, only to discover that the wallpaper was a different shade of pink, or that her bed had an extra pillow she didn't remember. The other families seemed unaware that anything was strange. They went about their evening routines as if their slightly wrong houses were perfectly normal. But Peppa noticed that they all moved in the same patterns, at the same times, like actors following a script they had memorized. When she tried to speak to one of the other mummy pigs, the woman looked at her with confusion, as if Peppa was the one who didn't belong. The other Peppa in that house stared at her with eyes that were the same color but somehow different, like looking at herself in a funhouse mirror. By midnight, Peppa had counted 17 different versions of her house, each one almost perfect but wrong in its own way. She began to worry that she might never find her real home again, or worse, that she might forget which differences were real and which were the mistakes. The episode ended with Peppa sitting in what she hoped was her real bedroom. But she couldn't be sure anymore. The room looked right, but so had all the others at first glance. As she closed her eyes to sleep, she could hear the sounds of all the other families in all the other houses, living their almost right lives just beyond the walls. And she wondered if she was the real Peppa, or just another copy in someone else's wrong house. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was helping Mummy Pig water the plants in the garden, but the flowers seemed to wilt and turn black as soon as the water touched them. The vibrant green leaves shriveled, and the colorful petals curled inward, revealing thorny, twisted stems. The soil beneath their feet began to crack and crumble, revealing not earth, but a dark, pulsating mass. A low, rhythmic thumping sound emanated from deep within the ground, like a giant heart beating. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay and something sweet, yet sickly. The familiar garden gnomes, usually so cheerful, now had vacant, staring eyes, their painted smiles frozen in a grotesque rictus. The garden, once a place of beauty and life, was transforming into a barren wasteland. The thumping grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled. Dark, thorny vines erupted from the cracked earth, snaking their way around the wilting plants, their thorns dripping with a viscous, black liquid. The sun, usually so bright, was obscured by a thick, unnatural mist that rolled in from the edges of the garden. The sound of buzzing insects filled the air, but these were not ordinary bees. They were large, black, and their wings beat with an ominous hum. The garden shed, usually a place for tools, now seemed to pulse with an internal, sickly green light. The plants, once their friends, were now turning against them, their thorny branches reaching out like grasping claws. The garden was no longer a place of growth, but of consumption, slowly devouring everything in its path. The thumping intensified, and a large, dark maw opened in the center of the garden, revealing rows of jagged, crystalline teeth. The house, their home, felt miles away, and the garden had become a living, breathing nightmare. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa's playroom had always been her favorite place in the house, filled with colorful toys and games that brought her joy. But tonight, as she entered to retrieve a forgotten book, the room felt different. All of her toys were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, facing inward as if they were having a meeting. The toy telephone was off its hook, emitting a soft dial tone that filled the room with an eerie hum. Her stuffed animals sat upright with their button eyes all turned toward the same spot, the empty space in the center of their circle. As Peppa watched, the toys began to move closer together, tightening their circle with small, jerky movements. The toy piano began to play a melody by itself, its keys depressing with invisible fingers, creating a tune that sounded almost familiar but wrong, like a lullaby played backwards. Her building blocks started to stack themselves into towers that defied gravity, balancing in impossible configurations that should have fallen but didn't. The jack-in-the-box began to turn its handle slowly, the tinny music playing at half speed, creating an ominous countdown to something terrible. Peppa tried to leave the room, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. The toys all turned to look at her simultaneously, their painted faces seeming more alive than they had any right to be. The stuffed animals' button eyes began to glow with a soft, sickly light, and their stitched mouths appeared to move as if they were trying to speak. The jack-in-the-box finally popped open, but instead of the usual clown, a tiny figure that looked exactly like Peppa emerged, its face twisted into an expression of pure terror. The toy Peppa pointed at the real Peppa and opened its mouth in a silent scream, and all the other toys began to move toward her, their movements becoming more fluid and lifelike with each step. The room filled with the sound of mechanical laughter, growing louder and more distorted until it became a cacophony of madness that seemed to come from the toys themselves.